The most dangerous man in Seoul left me a tip, and I pushed it back. I didn't know who he really was when I walked up to table 4. To me, he was just another quiet customer in a dark suit, sitting in the corner like he owned the place. But the silence around him should have warned me. 4 men stood behind his chair. No one at the table next to him was talking. Even the kitchen had gone strangely quiet. And in the middle of that silence sat a stack of $100 bills. Not one bill. Not 5. A stack. Most waitresses would have called it a miracle. I called it an insult. I set my silver tray down slowly, leaned over the table and slid the money back toward him. I think you made a mistake, Mr. Kang. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the men behind him shifted his hand inside his jacket. That was when my stomach dropped, because I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a rich customer. This was a man people were afraid of, and I had just told him no. James Kang finally looked up at me. His expression wasn't angry. It was curious. And somehow, that was worse. Because the kind of man who gets curious when you challenge him, that's the kind of man who decides whether you live or disappear. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever stood up to someone powerful, knowing it might cost you everything? If you know that feeling, subscribe. Because what happened after that moment changed my life forever. They say you don't know what you have until it's gone. But nobody talks about the chill that sets in when something you hated suddenly disappears. For 2 years, my ex Damon was the ghost that wouldn't stop haunting me. He was the unpaid debt of my life, always showing up at the restaurant, leaning over the counter with that same arrogant smirk, making sure I knew he still had a grip on my peace of mind. He was the guy who used to make me feel special before he made me feel stupid. Then, one Wednesday, the air just changed. Damon didn't show up. Not on Thursday, not on Friday. I checked his social media. Nothing but a void. I called a mutual friend, and her voice sounded tight, like she was afraid of her own phone. "He's gone, Maya," she said. "Just dropped off the map. Don't ask me again." I should have felt light. I should have danced in my tiny kitchen. But instead, I sat at my table and stared at a fresh cup of coffee sitting there. The coffee I hadn't ordered, yet it appeared on my break table exactly how I like it. My eyes drifted to the window. 3 spaces down, the black Mercedes sat idling, its windows dark like empty eyes watching my every move. I walked straight to the car. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I was done being a passenger. I tapped on the glass. It rolled down just an inch. "Where is he?" I whispered. The driver didn't answer. He just handed me a phone. It was already ringing. "He was a parasite, Maya?" James's voice came through the line, sounding as calm as a Sunday morning. "I simply removed the problem. You were losing sleep. Now you won't." I felt sick, not because I missed Damon, but because I realized James didn't just have money. He had the power to make people stop existing. He was playing God with my life, and he thought he was doing me a favor. I tried to ignore it. I tried to go back to my normal life, but the mall incident changed everything. I was just trying to buy a pair of shoes for work, standing in line at the food court. I wasn't thinking about him, wasn't looking over my shoulder. Then a guy bumped into me, hard. He started shouting, getting in my face, looking like he wanted to pick a fight for no reason. Before I could even open my mouth to apologize, 4 men in gray suits appeared out of the crowd. They didn't shout. They didn't make a scene. They just formed a wall around me. One of them put a hand on the guy's chest and whispered something quiet. The guy's face went gray, and he practically tripped over himself trying to get away. One of the suits turned to me. "Mr. Kang wishes for you to finish your shopping in peace, Miss Maya. We will be right here." I looked around the mall. For the first time, I didn't see shoppers. I saw a perimeter. I saw an escort. Every person who looked at me too long was being cataloged by men I didn't know. My freedom was just a longer leash. James wasn't just watching me. He had turned the entire city into my cage. I sat on a bench, my hands shaking. Was I safe? Or was I just a high-value priority being managed? I looked at my phone, wondering if I should call the police or call him. But what do you say when your stalker is the one keeping the monsters away? You know what hurts the most? Not what they did, but that I still tried to make them proud after everything. If you've ever given people too many chances, you already understand this pain. Don't just scroll. Subscribe. Join people who've been through it too, because you deserve stories that make you feel seen. They say money can't buy happiness, but in my world, money is the difference between breathing and drowning. My sister Tasha is my entire heart. She's the reason I smile through 12-hour shifts at the grill and the reason I save every nickel. I thought I was doing okay, slowly chipping away at her tuition until the day I opened her student portal and saw a balance of 0. No loans, no payment plan. Just a paid in full stamp that felt more like a brand on my skin. Then came the letter from the hospital, her mounting medical debt from that scare last winter, settled by a private donor. I didn't feel relief. I felt sick. I knew exactly who had reached into my life and rearranged the furniture. I walked out of my apartment, ignored the black Mercedes that was parked exactly 3 spaces away, and hailed a cab straight to the Kang commercial district. I was going to give him a piece of my mind, even if it was the last thing I did. I stormed past the front desk, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I reached his office, James didn't even look up from his desk. He just sat there, surrounded by glass and steel, looking like he owned the very sun. "Why?" I demanded, throwing the printed receipts onto his mahogany desk. "I didn't ask for your charity, James. I don't want your money." He looked up then. His eyes weren't cold. They were worse. They were sympathetic. "It wasn't charity, Maya. It was an investment in your peace. You were working yourself into a grave. If you're exhausted, you're distracted. And if you're distracted, you're in danger. So you just bought my life?" I felt the tears stinging my eyes, and I hated myself for it. "You think because you paid some bills, I belong to you now?" He stood up, walking around the desk with that slow, predatory grace. He didn't touch me, but he stood close enough that I could smell the expensive cedar on his skin. "I think that you are now free to focus on things other than survival. If that feels like belonging to me, perhaps you should ask yourself why you're so afraid to let someone carry your weight." I wanted to scream, but the truth was heavy. If I gave the money back, Tasha suffered. If I kept it, I was his. He hadn't just paid my debts, he had become my debt. And James Kang always collects. You know what hurts the most? Not what they did, but that I still tried to make them proud after everything. If you've ever given people too many chances, You already understand this pain. Don't just scroll. Subscribe. Join people who've been through it too, because you deserve stories that make you feel seen. The dress arrived at 6 p.m. It was deep emerald silk, the kind of fabric that felt like water against my skin. There was no note, just the driver waiting outside. I put it on because I knew I didn't have a choice. I wasn't Maya the waitress tonight. I was a trophy. The restaurant James took me to didn't have a name. It was tucked behind a nondescript door in an alleyway, but inside, it was a palace of gold and shadows. When we walked in, the entire room went silent. 6 men, all in tailored suits with eyes like sharks, sat at a long table. James pulled out my chair, his hand lingering on my shoulder for a split second longer than necessary. It was a claim, a warning to everyone in the room. "She doesn't speak Korean," one of the men said, not even looking at me. "Why is she here, James? This is business." "She is my business," James replied, his voice dropping an octave. The man laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "A waitress from the West? You're risking the territory for a girl who pours coffee for a living?" James didn't raise his voice. He didn't even reach for a weapon. He just leaned forward, his face illuminated by the candlelight. "She isn't just a girl. She's the woman who made me realize I've been too patient with men like you." The tension in the room was so thick I could barely swallow. I looked at the man who had insulted me, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt James's power behind me like a shield. But as I looked around the table at the cold, calculating faces, I realized I wasn't at a dinner. I was at a declaration of war. And I was the reason the first shot was about to be fired. I watched him handle them, realizing he was a monster among monsters. But he was my monster. Or was I just the latest thing he decided to own? I looked at the wine in my glass, dark and red, and wondered how much blood was going to be spilled because I couldn't say no to a medium rare steak and a paid in full stamp. You ever feel like you're playing a game where everyone else has the rule book and you're just trying not to trip over your own feet? That was me after that Syndicate dinner. I was supposed to be the quiet, protected heart James talked about, but my conscience didn't get the memo. I couldn't stop thinking about the way those men looked at me, like I was a problem to be solved. I started paying attention to the things James left around. He was usually so careful, so precise. But I think having me in his house, in his head, made him miss things. I found it in his study late one night, a ledger tucked under a stack of legitimate-looking real estate contracts. It wasn't just numbers. It was a history of how he moved money. And there, buried in a series of shell company transfers, was Tasha's tuition. He hadn't just paid it. He'd moved it through an account linked to a rival family. It was sloppy. A human mistake born out of a rush to save me. If his associates saw this, they wouldn't see a hero. They'd see a man who compromised their safety for a waitress. I realized right then that I held his life in my hands. I could take this to my manager, to the police, or to that man with the dry laugh at the dinner table. I could be free. But as I looked at the handwriting, so steady and firm, I realized I didn't want him to fall. Not yet. I was starting to realize that his cage was the only thing keeping the real wolves from my door. I couldn't sleep. The weight of that ledger felt like a physical heat in the room. I was sitting on the edge of the bed when the front door of the penthouse slammed open. That never happens. James has security that makes a bank vault look like a screen door. I heard shouting, not James's voice. but something rougher. Then the sound of glass breaking. I ran toward the hallway and saw James standing in the middle of the living room, his shirt torn, facing off against 3 men I didn't recognize. They weren't from his group. They were younger, hungrier, and they had rival written all over them. "Where is she?" one of them spat. "The girl who's worth the territory?" James didn't even look back at me, but I knew he felt me there. He moved like a flash of lightning. It wasn't like the movies. It was quick, quiet, and brutal. He didn't use a gun. He used his hands, his environment, his sheer will. In less than a minute, they were on the floor and James was breathing hard, a streak of red on his cheek that wasn't his. He finally turned to me. His eyes were wide, the mask of the cool boss completely gone. He looked vulnerable. He looked human. For the first time, he didn't look like my captor. He looked like my partner in a world that wanted us both gone. He reached out a hand, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. I took it. When I finally stood my ground, they called me heartless. But tell me, where were they when I was breaking? If you've ever had to choose peace over people, this channel is your space. Subscribe, not for me, but for every quiet soul who took their power back. They say you can't have peace without a little bit of war, but nobody told me the front lines would be in my own living room. After James took my hand, things changed. The air between us wasn't just heavy with fear anymore. It was thick with something else, something that made my skin tingle whenever he walked into the room. He started showing me the business side of things, teaching me how to read the people around him. It felt like a promotion, but I knew it was just another way to tie me to him. One night, we were looking over those shell company records. The tension was so high I could barely breathe. James leaned in, his voice a low rumble as he explained the risks we were taking. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't see the mob boss. I saw a man who was terrified of losing the only real thing he had left. Before I could think, he leaned across the desk. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was desperate and tasted like iron and cedar. It was a promise and a threat all wrapped into one. But the moment was shattered before it could even settle. One of his most trusted men, a guy I'd served coffee to a dozen times, burst in. He wasn't there for a meeting. He had a look in his eyes that told me everything had just gone wrong. He'd sold us out to the rival family. He didn't just want the money. He wanted James's head on a platter. I realized then that every time I let James get close, I was just putting a bigger target on both our backs. You know what hurts the most? Not what they did, but that I still tried to make them proud after everything. If you've ever given people too many chances, you already understand this pain. Don't just scroll. Subscribe. Join people who've been through it too, because you deserve stories that make you feel seen. I realized that night that being protected was just a pretty word for being a sitting duck. James was too busy fighting his own people to realize that the person he should be watching was me. I didn't want to be the reason someone else got hurt, especially not Tasha. So I did the one thing I promised I'd never do. I reached out to the man with the dry laugh, James's biggest rival. I thought I was being smart. I thought I was reclaiming my life by giving him a piece of James's business in exchange for my sister's safety and my own freedom. We met in a dark corner of a park I used to visit when I was still just Maya. He promised me the world. He promised me that James would never bother me again. I felt like I was finally winning, finally picking the lock to my own cage. But as I walked away, I saw the black Mercedes idling near the gate. It didn't follow me. It didn't move. It just sat there like a silent witness to my betrayal. That's when it hit me. James's rival didn't want to help me. He wanted to use me to gut James from the inside out. I hadn't found my independence. I had just handed the man I was starting to love over to his executioner. My rebellion wasn't a victory. It was a death sentence. I looked at my hands and realized that in this world, there are no clean breaks, only deeper holes. I thought I was the one playing the game, but I didn't realize the board had already been flipped. The phone call came at 2 a.m., a time when only bad news travels. It wasn't James. It was Tasha's voice, small and shaking, before a man's rough hand muffled her scream. My sister, the only innocent thing I had left, was gone, snatched right from her dorm. The rival I thought I could bargain with didn't want a deal. He wanted leverage to crush James once and for all. I fell to my knees in the middle of the penthouse, the air leaving my lungs like I'd been kicked. I had done this. My rebellion had put a target on my sister's back. James walked into the room, his face unreadable, his eyes reflecting the cold city lights. I expected him to yell, to throw my betrayal in my face, or to leave me to drown in my own mess. Instead, he just knelt beside me and pulled a burner phone from his jacket. I told you the world was hungry, Maya, he whispered, his voice vibrating with a deadly kind of calm. Now we're going to show them what happens when they try to eat what belongs to me. He wasn't following his own rules anymore. He was going rogue. He tossed his legitimate phones into the trash and grabbed a heavy bag from the safe. He was giving up his empire, his safety, and his name to find a girl he'd never even met. I realized then that his devotion wasn't a leash. It was a shield I had tried to break. And now it was the only thing that could bring Tasha home. The warehouse on the edge of the docks felt like the end of the world. The smell of salt and old grease was heavy in the air, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging over Tasha's chair. James didn't wait for a signal. He walked into the center of the room, hands empty, looking like a king walking toward his execution. I was behind the crates, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would give us away. The rival stepped out, a jagged smile on his face as he leveled a gun at James's chest. You gave up everything for a waitress, Kang, he mocked. Let's see if your life is worth as much as the tip you left her. Everything happened in a blur. James lunged toward Tasha, just as the first shot rang out, a sound that cracked the world wide open. But the bullet didn't hit Tasha. I screamed as James slumped against the chair, his hand still reaching for the knots on Tasha's wrists. He had taken the hit for me, stepping right into the path of a bullet I had practically fired myself the moment I made that secret deal. Blood was blooming across his white shirt like a dark flower. In that high-stakes moment, with the smell of gunpowder stinging my nose, the last bit of my pride finally crumbled. I didn't care about independence or self-respect anymore. I lunged toward him, my hands covering the heat of his wound, finally admitting to myself that I loved the man I had tried so hard to hate. When I finally stood my ground, they called me heartless. But tell me, where were they when I was breaking? If you've ever had to choose peace over people, this channel is your space. Subscribe, not for me, but for every quiet soul who took their power back. Silence is a heavy thing, but it's nothing compared to the weight of a dying man's hand in yours. With James slumped against Tasha's chair and the warehouse doors finally bursting open with his loyalists, the world turned into a blur of motion and shouting. James was drifting, his eyes losing focus as they loaded him onto a stretcher. His second in command, a man who usually looked like he wanted to bench press a car, turned to me with a look of pure desperation. "The syndicate is moving," he said, his voice shaking. "Without James to hold the line tonight, they'll wipe us out and finish what that rival started." I looked at Tasha, who was finally safe but shaking like a leaf, and then at the trail of red James had left behind. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I was the only person left who knew the business James had been teaching me over those long, tense nights. I stood up, wiping the heat of his blood onto my jeans. "Tell the men to gather at the safe house," I said. My voice sounded like someone else's, colder, sharper. "Tonight, we don't play defense. We do exactly what James would do, but we do it my way." For the next 6 hours, I was the one making the calls. I used my own wit to move his assets, cutting off the rival supply lines, and making sure the syndicate knew that James Kang's seat wasn't empty. I didn't have guns or a name, but I had the truth, and I knew exactly how to make people believe I was just as dangerous as the man in the hospital bed. By the time the sun started to peek over the docks, the threat had backed off. I had ensured our survival, but as I sat in the back of the black Mercedes, I realized I'd traded the last of my normal life for a seat at a table I never wanted to join. The hospital room was the quietest place I'd been in years, the only sound being the steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. James was pale, but he was breathing. When he finally opened his eyes and saw me sitting there, not as the waitress who had pushed back his money, but as the woman who had held his empire together for a night, he didn't say a word. He just reached for my hand with what little strength he had. "You kept them in line," he wheezed, a small pained smile touching his lips. I didn't smile back. I looked at him and realized that if we were going to do this, things had to change. I wasn't going to be a captive or a priority being managed ever again. I had seen the dark under the floorboards, and I knew I was the only one with enough light to keep us both from falling through. "I restructured things, James," I said, my voice steady. "The syndicate knows I'm the strategist now. From here on out, we don't rule through fear alone. We rule through the truth you tried so hard to hide." I was no longer just a guest in his world. I was the architect of the new one we were building. He had loved me into a corner, but I had grown into a woman of power who could finally look him in the eye as an equal. The leash was gone, and for the first time the cage was wide open, but I wasn't the one looking for the exit. When I finally stood my ground, they called me heartless. But tell me, where were they when I was breaking? If you've ever had to choose peace over people, this channel is your space. Subscribe, not for me, but for every quiet soul who took their power back. The air in the penthouse felt different today, like the walls had finally stopped leaning in. James was back on his feet, standing by the window and looking out at the city that still whispered his name in fear. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't offer a hand to guide me or a guard to watch my step. He offered me an envelope and a set of keys to a life I thought I'd lost forever, a way out. "The debt is settled, Maya," he said, his voice raw but certain. "Tasha is safe, the syndicate is stable, and you are free to walk out that door and never look back." I looked at the exit, then at the man who had bled for my mistakes. I thought about the waitress who used to serve ribeye and worry about the light bill, and I realized she didn't live here anymore. I had grown into someone who knew how to handle the dark, someone who had looked at the edge and didn't blink. I didn't want to go back to being a person things happened to. I wanted to be the person who made things happen. I reached out, but I didn't take the envelope. I took the locket he'd given me, the one that used to feel like a chain, and I put it back around my neck. "I'm staying, James," I whispered, and the tension that had been between us for months finally snapped into a different kind of peace. I was choosing this life, not out of survival or obligation, but on my own terms as a woman of power. We had both been through the fire, and we had come out as something new, something evolved. As we walked out to the black Mercedes together, I was the one who held the keys. I looked at the city lights and knew that our journey was just beginning, and this time, the rules were mine to write. Sometimes revenge isn't about payback. It's about peace. And if this story touched you, subscribe right now. Because somewhere out there, another person is watching in silence, needing a reminder that they're not alone. And your one click might help them find it. The waitress who broke the rules is gone, but the woman who makes them is just getting started. Subscribe to find out what happens when the empire finally meets its match.